We all set to go, Megan?
Yep, you're good.
Fantastic. Welcome, everybody. We're glad that you're here. Welcome to ULA Conference Day 2, if you weren't here with us in pre-conference. And I'm Daniel Mockley, the ULA president for this year. It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed yesterday, and those of you that were here with us, I hope you did too. We look forward to having you today. And if you're watching this on demand later, thanks for watching this session on demand. And I hope that you find a lot of other things that you enjoy. Our theme is We Are the Heart. You've heard that all year. We'll talk a little bit about that later. This is the membership meeting. We have an annual membership meeting, which will take just about maybe half an hour. And then we will jump in with our keynote speaker at a little about 9:30, around there. We do have some conference hashtags going on right now. We have ULA 2021, of course, and then ULA We Are the Heart. If you'd like to post about this on your social media, please feel free to do so. I want to start off by thanking our conference committee. That it has not been a simple process for us to transition to a virtual conference for the first time, but we are so glad that we were able to do a conference regardless. You see these many wonderful people here who have contributed, whether it be the program, whether it be social media, grants, swag, hospitality, scholarships, everything. These fantastic people have carried the load, and I appreciate their effort. I do want to make specific mention, though, of these four in particular who have been the leaders of the whole effort. Christopher Davis, our conference co-chair, and Becca Lal, who is also our conference co-chair, which is kind of unique in this situation, but the two of them have carried this very well, and we're grateful for them. Liz Gabbitas has been our program board chair throughout the entire year, and Megan Lloyd, who apparently has no photo of herself on the internet, so she gets her logo instead, but she's been our event planner and done phenomenally in arranging with Cvent, who is our platform today for our conference, and they have been very good to work with. We're learning from this experience. We apologize for any technical glitches. Please let us know in the feedback so we know how to do this better. Hopefully we won't have to do this next year, but either way, it's good feedback for us to learn from. This has not been easy to get sponsors this year with the challenges of COVID and budgets. Even, I mean, you're aware of businesses not struggling to make it, and virtual setting hasn't been the easiest for sponsors and exhibitors to work with because they can't see you face to face. You know, it's hard to pitch to somebody across the internet. So we do want to give a big thank you to these sponsors who still contributed to make this conference possible. We really needed it. We obviously lowered our conference rate, trying to help out everybody to be able to afford to come, and they help balance out our budget, and we'll be talking budget later and our needs there. So thank you to all of these wonderful people that participated, and then our exhibitors here, of course, as well. And you see that there are still many that came on and helped us out here. As you can't see them in person, please take note of that window to the right. That is a screenshot of your attendee hub. The exhibitors are located there. Please click on the exhibitors tab and you will find these and others, sponsors really, that don't have an exhibitor page there. You'll be able to click on them. Some do have some virtual live hours, some do not, but all have a video, and you can connect to any of them. So there's not really an exhibitor hall time, but we encourage you to go anytime during these next 2 days, and really hope you'll take the time to at least chat with them. They made a big sacrifice to be here with us and to contribute to our conference. Thank you to these wonderful groups that did. I do want to give a shout out to National History Explorer Corps. They aren't selling anything. They are actually trying to be a collaborative partner in this. They are working very specifically with public libraries. In all 29 counties of the state, there has been a marker placed that is celebrating some historical or cultural aspect of each of our counties. They've already been done by O.C. Tanner, and they're in place. Many public libraries have also received a collection of books from Utah. There's a quick example right here. Utah 13ers, about the peaks that are over 13,000 feet. I picked this up yesterday from our box that we received. These are being given to be added to our collections for patrons to borrow. And There is marketing materials coming to the libraries to help promote the marker. We're encouraging Utah and all of our residents to go and travel and find these markers and do a little scavenger hunt. The library is a place to help promote that. The launch will be officially next week on the 25th. And Utah State Library has been a big help in helping us get the books as well. So a wonderful thing that costs nothing to us, but is a good partnership. I also want to make mention that the Natural History Museum, who is hosting these Explorer Corps, is also offering some STEM programming that they will do for free if you schedule it with them. If you are interested in making that happen, please contact the Natural History Museum about their Explorer Corps outreach programming, and Beth Mitchell in particular. They have a booth in the Exhibitors. If you want more information about all of this, please check them out in the Exhibitor booth as well. There is, of course, we always have our ULA Career Services booth. We can't be there in person, so they are in the Exhibitor tab as well. We don't have somebody sitting there 24/7, but there are many resources there and appointments can be set up. Take a look at that as well if we can be of any help in helping you with employment in some fashion. We do want to make mention of the gamification feature that is in the conference right now. We do have some incentives, some gift cards for those of you that happen to be the winners. So there is something to gun for rather than just the glory of being the winner. So find that game tag on the attendee hub as well. And you can start getting, I believe it's stamps or some fashion with exhibitors and whatnot. We still have a silent auction going on, which funds our scholarship funds that aren't just for ULA conference. ULA members can apply for this scholarship to other professional development. So this is an important thing to help our members that are in financial need, which there are many right now. That silent auction is also occurring in the Exhibitors tab. You do notice on that screenshot that to see that you'll be taken to Octria, which is where all those items are located, and then the bidding can begin. The auction will remain open until 2 p.m. tomorrow. So you have until lunchtime tomorrow to watch the bidding and see how it goes. We will mail the items to you. So don't worry about that. It is part of the auction, and we hope you'll take a look at that. But if anything, come today at 3:30 just to chat. Most of the time we're listening and paying attention in classes, but we'd just love to see your face and chat with you this afternoon at 3:30. We don't have a swag table again, but we do have a virtual shop. And so if this motto or anything rings true to you, we encourage you to take a look at this. There is a tab on one of the conference pages and platforms there, but if you want to just go directly to this, Utah Library Association.creatorspring.com, you'll find this along with swag for 2022 conference. Rita Christensen's already on it. If you want to take a look at some of the things that they got going there, and the 2020 conference that it's going to be rare, right? Because we weren't able to hardly distribute it, but Acuity 2020 is also there. We had a great election just a couple months ago, and I want to, obviously you see our candidates that did win, but I want to thank all that participated and put their hat in the ring. It is nerve-wracking and it's not easy to run. So we appreciate everyone that ran. We had many roundtable leaders get elected. I didn't put them all here, but I do want to make mention of our association leaders. We congratulate Marissa Bischoff, who is president-elect of ULA and will be vice president starting this weekend. And then Emily Bulla is one of our board members at large. Emily Swenson-Darowski has been reelected as a board member at large. And then Trish Hall has taken up the role of ALA counselor for us. And Sherry Mortensen, I love that picture of you, Sherry, is our MPLA representative. And all 5 of these that you see at top have been elected to 3-year terms starting this weekend, and will be serving us in that regard. We also have 2 sections that were elected: academic section with Dan Broadbent and Diana Miser as chair-elect. Janae Wanshoff is our special section library chair, and Karen Newmeyer is the chair-elect. They all have votes on the board. We make mention of the Library Day on the Hill for 2022. February 3rd is when it's scheduled, and we're really hopeful that we'll be there in person this time. This was a great success in 2020. Right before everything went down, we did get an in-person Library Day on the Hill, and we visited 80 of the 100, just over 100 legislators in person with the librarians that came. It was a joint effort with our sister organization, UELMA, our school library organization, the Utah State Library, and the Utah Academic Library Consortium. It ended up with a successful bid on a bill that we were hoping for rural digital help in 2020. We did have an attempt at a virtual one this year, and we'll talk a little bit about that in our report. We are hoping conferences in Layton next year. Davis Convention Center is where we're scheduled for May 18th to the 20th of 2022. So we look forward to, hopefully, I really hope so, seeing you in person next year in Layton, Utah. We had a lot of things happen with the board this year behind the scenes. One of the most significant things that happened was that Barbara Winters, who's been our Ula Executive Director for many years, is departing us and moving on to other things. We really appreciate her years of service and what she's done to keep moving ULA forward. And we'll be recognizing her this afternoon, but we do want to welcome Mindy Hell as our new ULA Executive Director. It was a very competitive pool of applicants. We were super impressed, and Mindy is excellent. She's helped us before as newsletter editor and served in other library positions. She's going to be a great addition to ULA's governance. As this is a membership meeting, I will say that I didn't receive any resolutions or motions from you as a membership. So I'm just going to give you the report, and then we're going to turn the time over to Javid, who will give us our financial report. But I do feel that it's important to let you know what we were attempting to accomplish for you throughout this last year, just highlights. But we pulled off a virtual fall workshop, and those videos are still online for free. If you missed some of those sessions, including the keynotes, we encourage you to take a look at those if you'd still like to see them. We were super disappointed about not being able to recognize our award winners in person, with the conference being canceled pretty much last minute last year. So Rita and Vern and I went around and we toured and we delivered all the awards in person. And that was a real pleasure to be able to see everyone, and you see a shot of one of the awards there. We're going to do the same here in a couple of weeks with our award winners this year. There was legislation, good and bad, that we were dealing with along with our sister organization, UELMA. House Bill 38 did pass, which was of concern because it is putting in language that may attack our EBSCO databases in the schools again. It's not supposed to work that way. I want to thank Peter Bromberg, our advocacy chair, and Jim Wilson, president-elect of UELMA, who really had their boots on the ground, communicating late hours into the night during our legislative session with lawmakers and other interested parties, trying to help them understand the censorship problems that bill was going to pose. And though it did not turn out successfully in our effort and it still passed, there were some good things that were accomplished, and hopefully with UETN we can help them develop a good collection development policy on how that can be dealt with in the future, so that our school children aren't blocked from important sources of information due to an effort to overprotect, I guess I would say. We also were pulling for House Bill 304, which was a digital opportunity access amendment, which would have created a digital equity program with the Utah State Library. Unfortunately, that narrowly failed and it didn't go through. So we are learning from that as we approach Library Day on the Hill for 2022. Of interest to the board, we worked for 2 years on revising our bylaws and helping streamline some of our governance. That we want to thank all the members that attended the session yesterday morning at 8 in the morning. Thank you for showing up and taking a vote. The reason it wasn't in your ballot is because the revision was so many changes of just helping to update it and adding some important things of how to deal with governance vacancy and things like that. That's been done and it's on the website. and appreciate all the help to get that across the line. We've worked with some legal counsel on developing a copyright policy, which was really important for this conference and how we're dealing with our recordings. And that's in place. And that was a lot of hard work from our Vice President, Rita Christensen. Do want to look forward again. We talked about 2022. We're going to go back to St. George in 2023. we were so disappointed to not make it down where our ULA members are in the South. And we were just looking forward to St. George. And they were so good in dealing with us when we had to cancel. And they're already arranging for us to have a similar rate to what it was without an increase, which is phenomenal. So we're looking forward to 2023 conference in St. George. And some of you know that MPLA was supposed to be here right now with us, Mountain Plains Library Association for a joint conference. It didn't happen, but we've already voted as a ULA board, and MPLA has as well, that they're already going to try to come back in 2024. And so we'll see them in Sandy, and that will be our effort there. I want to thank the Diversity Services Roundtable for developing what I thought was a phenomenal statement, and so did the board, quite frankly. A motion was immediately made for the ULA board to adopt the statement on systemic racism, which was sent out in the fall of last year. We have worked on formalizing our ULA historical archives agreements with the University of Utah, and they have been phenomenal. And Allie McCormick has been, our historian's been helpful in that regard. Want to let you know that we're planning on doing a formal audit of ULA. Not that Javid's done anything wrong, he's phenomenal, but it's in our bylaws that we should be doing so. And it's good practice for us to make sure everything's going fine. It has not been done in a long time, but that is already in the works for this summer. And we are also taking right now requests for qualifications for a strategic planner to help us develop a strategic plan for ULA in the coming year. And so lots of things that are going on in the background, and we've tried to work hard throughout the year. I would like to turn the time over now to Javid if he's with us, and I'll stop screen sharing, and he will update us with our financial outlook so far.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Happy to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to share Utah Library Association's financial updates. I am Javed Lal. I'm the treasurer of Utah Library Association, and glad you could join us today. Like everybody else, last year was certainly very challenging for many small associations, including Utah Library Association. But fortunately, we've been working for years to create some kind of cushion, some reserve for emergencies like that we faced last year and still facing. We suddenly took some hit when it came to the cancellation of the conference, the registration, refund. But end of the day, with all the cancellation, with the refund and negotiated settlement that we had with our vendors and other parties, we ended up at about $13,000 in non-refundable expenditures. So that means we were in negative territory for about $13,000 just for the conference. Overall, we were still in deficit, about $21,000, which is significant for an organization like us, but we were able to absorb some of that with our reserve fund, which is good news. I think we had this long-term plan that we have to maintain some minimum reserve for our organization. At end of the last year, our cash reserves or certificate of deposits were about $111,000. That was after all the refunds and payments. And our net equity was about $106,000. That's just a high level. I'll share my screen so you can see some of those numbers yourself. Okay, so if what you're looking at right now is our balance sheet. It's comparing 2 years of the information. The first column that you're looking at is the end of the last year. That's the last year report that we finished on June 30th, 2020. And then the second column that you're looking at is year to date, current as of today. You can see our cash reserves and bank account balance was about $111,257 at end of last year. Our net equity, which is what we can spend on program, is about $106,000 last year at the time. But we have about $4,684 for our ULA scholarship fund. So I do encourage you to apply for scholarship opportunities. For year to date today, our current reserve is about $81,489. That leaves us about 76,008.05 in our net equity that we can spend on programming. We still have funds available for ULA scholarship, but even you can see some drop in our fund balance, but this time of the year is definitely when we are spending more and there's less intake. And part of the reason is we've been spending some expenditure for the conference. There's some speakers fees that we're paying. But as we start to receive the payment from our registration from our vendor, we'll be able to bring that up in the near future. This is the summary of our income and expenditure. Last year, total income was about 24,000. That's definitely way low than we would normally have. And that's the main reason, obviously, is the conference cancellation. We had still about 3,300 that was carried forward into next year as some of the exhibitors decided to continue those contributions or some sponsorship that we had. Our dividend income was about 1,270. So we received some general donations, about $101. Our membership income actually dropped to last year. It was about $17,499. There's some other general donations, about $200. And then there's some other program that we had, like a fall conference, and that we had last year. That total resulted in about 24,000. Our expenditure about 45,000. You can see this was our net payment to our conference expenditure, about $13,189. Professional fee is one of another large expense that we incur. We have some technology that our website, or some of the subscription membership software subscription that we have, and there's some travel last year. We ended up being about 45,000 as total expenditure. Or overall, it's still, like I mentioned, it's 21,000 negative, but I think this could have been worse considering all the challenges that we faced last year. Currently, at this time of the year, we are current revenues about $36,000, and you can see it's more than even last year right now. And partly we have started to receive some revenue from the annual conference. Our membership has gone up for sure. There's some other programming that happened that continue to grow there in the future. Our year end on June 30th, so I think we'll have a final report after June 30th. But this is just a point in time summary. Our total expenditure, you can see, is about $66,000. Most of that is coming from annual conference expenditure. That's 36,000. Professional fees is another one, and then technology is our third highest expenditure category. That leaves us about at 29,000 in negative. But as I mentioned, as we go into the closing of the year, we'll have more revenue coming in from the conference and some account receivables that we have. We hope to be in positive territory. So that is the overall summary. This report will be available on our website. You are welcome to look at it. There's another detailed page that gives you more breakdowns on how we are collecting this information for income, for example. Annual conference have exhibition, advertising, there's registration fee, there's sponsorship and brand, and so forth. So this will be available on the website, but also the final report will be after June 30th. That's all I have. Thanks so much, Daniel. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Javeed. We appreciate all you've done with that. And as I understand it, that does not include all of the annual conference revenue from this conference yet, right? We're still bringing in money from this conference.
That is correct. Yes.
That's the good news about that. That red at the bottom. So wonderful job. Thank you.
Okay.
Let me wrap up here, and then we'll be listening to our keynote speaker. But I just want to talk about the theme as we pass it over to our keynote speaker, and the business is done. Let's talk theme. I shared this in one of the pre-conferences yesterday, and some of you probably heard about this. It's really struck me how much effect this pandemic has had on people, not just their physical health, but in so many ways. You probably may have heard of the situation that happened in Fantasy Canyon, not far from where I work. where a mother took her child and unfortunately killed her child, and she was seriously injured near this area. The thing that I did not know until later was that this is somebody that was well known to my neighboring library, a good person. And something unfortunate has happened where the life just got to be too much. And the library had been a lifeline for this person, came to story time and did a lot of things that probably helped lift her burden. But during the pandemic, that was not available. And not that the library was an only factor, but certainly a significant factor that was positive, that maybe could have turned something around there. I think all of us have suffered in some fashion from the coronavirus and its effects on our mental health, our emotional health, social, certainly physical. And I know that there are members here that have lost loved ones from the virus, and that is very hard. And we feel for that. We have sympathy for that. And we know that you and the patrons have been affected. Something that I had the opportunity for my staff and I to do just a couple weeks ago is to attend a course called Mental Health First Aid, which was an all-day class. And some of you have probably already taken it. It really struck me as I was taking that course, what a stigma is around mental health. And with, you know, so many of us go to the doctor, they're busy all day long, and, you know, breaks of bones happen, people get illnesses, and we don't go around saying, gosh, they must have done something stupid. At least we shouldn't be, right? Or they must have gotten that flu because they did something wrong, you know, or they just can't handle it. They're weak. Yet with mental health, there's so many things that affect us, and Corona has really, I think, exasperated that why is that stigma there? And people need that. We have people that come to our library that are in need of our service and our help, and just us as a people. We are the heart. This is hanging above my desk right now. I modified it a little bit from Dilji Renlund, who I heard last fall. He was talking about his experience when he was interning as a doctor. And this was an experience that he overheard with a fellow colleague when she was struggling with a particular person that always came back to the hospital and was, in her mind, self-inflicting. And she had already dealt with a lot of people. Why in the world does she have to keep dealing with these people? And a wise doctor that Dell overheard said this quote. And to me, it just struck like gold to me of what I need to do as a librarian, because I am working on this. I still struggle with this. And if I'm going to be the heart of my library, I need to work on this. You became a librarian to help people. You didn't become a librarian to judge them. If you don't understand the difference, you have no right to work in the library. And that has just been in my mind and heart ever since. It's hanging on my wall. Do you have this? Is it something that we can all remember as we're working with everyone? The things we can't see, or the stories we just don't know as we're quickly dealing with patrons. What could we save? What could we help? I shared some of these pictures last year. This is what people need, right? And I shared this other quote yesterday: bad libraries only build collections. Good libraries build services. Great libraries build communities. And I think some of these photos give us a great idea of what has been missing. Our collections, for the most part, I think through curbside service or electronic, have been available even throughout the pandemic. And I think we're even striving to give good services. But I think our patrons are hungry and thirsting for the day that they will have you again, full service for their community. They need you. It's become very apparent over Corona what our library value really is to people. It's our interaction. It's how we build them up. It's not our stuff, and it's not even the programs we do. It's what we give them of us every day that could save a life in some cases. I know that you are this. You are the heart, And I hope that throughout this conference, I know that was a little sobering, but I hope that you'll pick up on some great things throughout conference and hopefully gear up for the waning down, I hope, of the pandemic over the next year and getting people back to what we can give them. They're waiting for us, and I hope that we'll be ready to have them back. Thank you for joining us for conference, and I am excited to turn the time over now to our ALA Odd Loss office. They're going to talk about microaggressions today, which is not the same content that you heard in pre-conference yesterday if you attended. That's the good news. This is new content. So Kristen and Mariel, may I turn it over to you?
Yes, thank you, Daniel. That was a really poignant conversation to follow, and I want to say how much we appreciate your entrusting us with presenting pre-conferences yesterday and this keynote today. My name is Kristen LaHerde. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am the interim director of the American Library Association's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, or as we call it sometimes, ODLOS. Our office's mission is to support library and information science workers in creating all-inclusive spaces that serve and represent the entire community. We work across the association and the library profession to advise, to facilitate, coordinate, train, specifically in the areas of equity, diversity, inclusion, literacy, and outreach, as those areas intersect with social justice. We've uploaded a handout for today that includes definitions, resources, and a couple of the tools or activities that we'll be talking about. The handout, if you didn't already see it, should appear under the speaker information. Thank you.
And Daniel, I just want to echo Kristen and all of ULA. Thanks so much for having us. It has been a pleasure. I'm Mariel Colbert, and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I serve as the program officer in ALA's Chapter Relations Office. And you might be familiar with the Chapter Relations Office, as it promotes a sense of identification between the National Association and the 57 ALA chapters. And so we both just shared our pronouns as an inclusive practice that comes out of the LGBTQIA+ community. And we do this to create an inclusive space and environment that is affirming of the way that people want to be referred to. So our objectives today are to frame the notion of privilege as a social justice concept, to consider how privilege and implicit or unconscious bias create barriers for our staff and our community. So for those who joined us yesterday for the pre-conference, the piece on implicit bias might be familiar. Today, we'll also examine the implications and impact of privilege and microaggressions, and we'll explore how to identify and begin to address microaggressions. And before we fully kick off, I want to say that all of these objectives could warrant their own workshop or presentation. The hope is that this introduction will inspire you to dig deeper. So when we say we're framing the notion of privilege as a social justice concept, what do we mean by social justice? At ALA, we approach social justice as a goal and a process. As a goal, social justice is the full and equitable participation of people from all social identity groups in a society that is mutually shaped to meet their needs. It looks like a world in which the distribution of resources is equitable and sustainable, and all members are physically and psychologically safe, secure, recognized, and treated with respect. As a process, social justice is democratic and participatory. It's respectful and affirming of human agency, and it builds capacity for working collaboratively with others to create change. The process involves exploring power and privilege within individuals, systems, and institutions. And that framing is adopted from Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, the 3rd edition of that book. So to synthesize the goal and the process into a definition, social justice focuses on power dynamics among different groups of people while acknowledging historical and institutional inequities. It has a vision of a society with equitable distribution of resources in which all members are physically and psychologically safe and secure, are recognized and treated with respect.
So as with social justice, we like to start out all of our concepts with definitions to really ground us in a shared understanding. So to start examining privilege, we've broken the definition down into 3 key points. Privilege is benefiting from social group membership or social identities. It is the systemic favoring, validating, and including of certain social identities over others. And individuals cannot opt out of systems of privilege. Rather, these systems are inherent to the society in which we live. So the benefits that come from privilege are not earned, but rather they result from social advantage relative to others' disadvantage. And the systemic nature of privilege is key. Privilege is not about who we are as individuals. It is about systems that oppress some and privilege others. So what does that look like? For one, it looks like the racial wealth gap from generations of discrimination and inequity. The average white household has 13 times the financial worth of the average Black household and 11 times the financial worth of the average Hispanic household. And when we say wealth, we mean the sum of resources available to a household at a given time. So if we look at that disparity in dollar amounts, according to What We Get Wrong About Closing the Racial Wealth Gap, which is a 2018 report by Duke University's Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity, a quote, white household living near the poverty line typically has about $18,000 in wealth, while Black households near the poverty line typically have a median wealth near 0. So that alone is striking. But with 0 as the median, that means many Black families have a negative net worth. So privilege is systemic, and we don't have control over which identities we have privilege in. But what is within our control is being aware of our privilege and holding ourselves accountable. And that includes asking questions like, how am I taking space and how am I making space for those with marginalized identities? How am I using my privilege to speak out in situations that might be riskier for others? We'll look at some more commonly discussed forms of privilege.
So there are many types of privilege, and each of us holds privilege in some identities and not others. And these identities can include race, with white privilege being at the top of the hierarchy. It can include gender, and that can include male privilege or cisgender privilege, which means that your gender identity matches the sex you were assigned at birth. So woman and female, for example. And last, binary gender privilege, or the social construct of 2 genders, meaning a man and a woman or a boy and a girl. It can look like sexual orientation with heterosexuality at the top. It can look like ability with able-bodied people at the top. And this also includes invisible and invisible abilities and disabilities, such as neurodiversity. It can be privilege in religion with Christianity, for example, as a religious privilege in many parts of the world. But we also want to recognize that this is not a comprehensive list. Rather, it's a snapshot of the types of privilege that exist in the world. But we've designated the last type as an unnamed social identity to recognize that there are always more identities to consider. The hierarchies of social identities rely on associations that are both implicit and explicit, and norms around behaviors that are accepted and familiar. So for example, I'm heterosexual, and I didn't have to come out as heterosexual because it's considered the norm in our society. KJ Rawson, who is a transgender scholar and professor of English and gender studies, puts it this way. They say, quote, "It's an incredible and invisible power to not need to name yourself because the norms have already done that for you. You don't need to come out as heterosexual because it's already expected." So looking at another example, I'm also able-bodied. So when I enter spaces, I generally don't have to think twice about whether or not they will be accessible to me or to my body. I don't have the same considerations or awareness of mobility or moving through space as someone who uses a wheelchair or a scooter, because I assume, usually correctly, that these spaces are built for someone like me to access. I have privilege because I'm able-bodied, and privilege to even forget at times that it's a consideration for many individuals. So we'll look at social identities through an activity that we usually do in interactive trainings. We won't do it together today, but we've made it available to you so that you can do it later on your own. So it's included in those resources that we're sharing. And this image may be familiar to you. It's of a social identity wheel. We recommend this activity as a way to build self-awareness, which, along with a systemic and structural analysis, is key to unpacking privilege. And this is because whether we are cognizant of them or not, our social identities influence the lens through which we experience the world. And it's helpful to remember the lens of our identities and lived experiences that we bring into a space, and that these may not be the same as our colleagues or other participants in that space. The identities that are pre-populated are common for equity, diversity, and inclusion work, but we've added a blank one for an identity of your choice. So the activity is to name how you identify for each of these. For age, for example, I might put my chronological age or my generation. For gender, I would put cis female, and for race, I would put multiracial. But you can fill this in however you would like and however you identify. So then after completing the will, the next step is to circle the identities that we think about most often or on a daily or near daily basis, and then to reflect on what we notice about those identities that we think about most often. Maybe, and then, think about what identities we think about less frequently or not on a daily basis. So is there a pattern there? Is there a pattern between those identities? And what's key is that often the identities we think about the least are the ones in which we hold privilege. So we can take those identities for granted because we have access to power and to privilege. So exploring social identities individually doesn't tell the whole story of privilege. We need to understand intersectionality as well. Intersectionality is multiple forms of discrimination, for example, racism or sexism or homophobia, coming together or intersecting in overlapping systems of oppression. So the term intersectionality was coined 20 years ago by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a lawyer and a current professor at Columbia Law School. And it's a concept that aims to create a frame to provide visibility and understanding to the reality that there are many people who are impacted by more than one identity. So to help us continue thinking about intersectionality, we'll watch a short video that gives a great explanation of it.
What is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a way of understanding social relations by examining intersecting forms of discrimination. This means acknowledging that social systems are complicated and that many forms of oppression, like racism, sexism, and ageism, might be present and active at the same time in a person's life. Everyday approaches to building equality tend to focus on one type of discrimination, for instance sexism, and then work to address only that specific concern. But while the career of a young, white and able-bodied woman might improve with gender equality protections, an older, black, disabled lesbian may continue to be hampered by racism, ageism, ableism and homophobia in the workplace. Intersectionality is about understanding and addressing all potential roadblocks to an individual or group's well-being. But it's not as simple as just adding up oppressions and addressing each one individually. Racism, sexism, and ableism exist on their own, but when combined, they compound and transform the experience of oppression. Intersectionality acknowledges that unique oppressions exist, but is also dedicated to understanding how they change in combination. The roots of intersectionality lie within the Black feminist movement, with legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw originating the term. Crenshaw felt that anti-racist and feminist movements were both overlooking the unique challenges faced by Black women. She stated that legislation about race is framed to protect Black men, and legislation about sexism is understood to protect white women. So simply combining racism and sexism together does not therefore protect Black women. Intersectional theory is now applied across a range of social divisions and also to understandings of domination, such as those associated with whiteness, masculinity, and heterosexuality. Intersectionality is not only about multiple identities, and it's not a simple answer to solving problems around equality and diversity. It is, however, an essential framework as we truly engage with issues around privilege and power and work to bring them into the open. Intersectionality means listening to others, examining our own privileges, and asking questions about who may be excluded or adversely affected by our work. As importantly, it means taking measurable action to invite, include, and centre the voices and work of marginalised individuals.
So Crenshaw coined this term because she saw it as roads intersecting, where racism and sexism are two roads that come together for women of color. Previously, this was seen as two separate roads, where there was no frame for the experiences of women of color at all. Their experiences were put into one of the two lanes and completely ignored where they intersect. So intersectionality was her way of giving name to this phenomenon. We also encourage you to watch a TED Talk by Kimberly Crenshaw called The Urgency of Intersectionality, which we've included in the resources provided today. We also included this screenshot of a tweet from the Associated Press from November 7th, as they announced Biden and President-elect Harris as Biden and as president-elect and Harris as vice president-elect, because it calls out Harris's identities. And what stood out to us in this framing is that it first says Black woman, and then it says person of South Asian descent, and finally woman. But Black woman here is key. What intersectionality teaches us is that these are not discrete identities: Black, South Asian, and woman. Harris represents a lot of historical firsts, and calling out those identities highlights that, but those identities aren't separate. Rather than having experiences as a woman separate from her experiences as a Black person or a South Asian person, these identities overlap and intersect and act together in unique ways and amidst systems of oppression.
So intersectionality of identities is about very real social impacts and implications. Yet we want to keep in mind that all social identities are constructed. They are created by humans and perpetuated by humans through cultural norms, and they are contestable. A very relevant example is how race has been constructed in the United States to justify socioeconomic arrangements, slavery, land seizure, and how racial categories have shifted by time and place. The image here is of a registration of birth and color from Virginia, initiated with the state's Racial Integrity Act of 1924, a law that required the racial makeup of people to be recorded at birth to prevent marriage between, quote, white persons and non-white persons. This law was in effect until 1967, when it was overturned by the Supreme Court in Loving versus Virginia. The bottom of the card reads, "A white person is one with no trace whatever of blood of another race, except that one with 1/16 of the blood of American Indian, unmixed with other race, may be classed as white." The back of the registration card notes that the penalty for making a false statement as to color is 1 year in the penitentiary. As writer Bonnie Suey summarizes in an article in the New York Times, quote, "In 1870, mixed race American Indians living on reservations were counted as Indians, but if they lived in white communities, they were counted as whites. And who was white evolved over time. From the 1870s to the 1930s, court rulings pondered the, quote, whiteness of Asian immigrants from China, Japan, India, often changing definitions by the ruling in order to exclude yet another group from citizenship. In 1930, nativist lobbyists succeeded in getting Mexicans officially labeled non-white on the census. Up until then, they had been considered white and allowed citizenship. So racial categorization is fluid and it's contestable depending on how it serves those in power. With privilege, there's a lot to uncover in terms of high-level categories and these constructs, but it's also helpful to examine privilege in concrete ways that it plays out. It can take shape as freedom to move through spaces without concerns for your safety. So as a woman, I don't walk alone at night, and I'm also always aware of my surroundings. At the same time, I have the privilege of not fearing potential life or death consequences of being stopped by the police. Privilege looks like power. It's of course being in positions of power, but it's not only that. It's also the power to be heard, that your voice carries weight. And it's even the power over other people's safety. So as an example of that, I think of, outing somebody as transgender at work or at school. I have a school-age child, and if a child comes out to mine as transgender, it's my responsibility to make sure that my child knows that that's not their secret to share and that they can't compromise that other child's safety. Privilege looks like access to education, to voting, to wealth. So we can think back to the generational wealth example I gave earlier, but I want to stay with voting for a minute. Voting is a constitutional right, and yet states have the power to determine access to that right. For example, only 2 states, Maine and Vermont, grant those who are incarcerated their status as citizens, and therefore they maintain their right to vote. And there are many barriers to access outside of incarceration. Georgia has an exact match law, for example, that disproportionately affects women and people of color. So exact match flags voter registrations that have any discrepancies with other official identification documents in the state records. And they're subject to human error in the data entry, particularly when there's a hyphen in a name or an apostrophe. So women who more often hyphenate their last names with marriage, and people of color who might have hyphenated first names or an apostrophe in their first name. As the American Bar Association revealed, quote, of the 51,000 individuals that this law affected in 2018, 80% of them were African American. And there is evidence that the exact match law played a role in the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial election, as African American candidate Stacey Abrams lost by approximately 55,000 votes. When we talk about privilege, we are not trying to erase the very real struggles that individuals have, but rather to examine how privilege works as a system. So let's take the healthcare system as an example, and maternal mortality, which is a really strong indicator within that. According to the CDC's most recent data, the maternal mortality rate for Black mothers is more than double that of white mothers, 37.1 deaths per 100,000 live births, compared to 14.7. The most recent data don't include a breakdown for American Indian and Alaska Native mothers, but the disparities are similar to those of Black mothers to white. The chart here shows that the racial disparities in maternal mortality persist across education levels, and they're especially striking at the level of college graduate or higher. So we use this to point out that educational privilege does not counteract systemic racism. Educational privilege doesn't lead to better care or to better health outcomes for Black mothers. As I said earlier, privilege is not either or. Everyone has privilege in some of their identities. So individuals may come from a poor economic background, but they may still hold privilege, white privilege, or male privilege, for example. And people of color may not have white privilege, but they may have gender privilege or heterosexual privilege. So to think about privilege, specifically in relation to libraries, we have an activity we used called Privilege in Libraries. Peggy McIntosh has one of the most widely used pieces on identifying privilege called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. You may be familiar with it. It is framed as a yes or no checklist. You mark yes to a scenario if you have privilege in that area, and you answer no if you do not have privilege in that area. John Barry adapted the checklist to examine privilege in libraries, and then we've created an activity from that, which we've included in the handouts. So one example, referencing the example shared earlier about accessibility, is I can enter library spaces without taking into account physical accessibility. When we use this activity, we encourage reflecting on the responses by asking such questions as, how might you use these or other privileges in a constructive way to disrupt systems of oppression? For example, for the question, I can examine the majority of materials in my library, print or media, and see people of my race widely and positively represented. If I answer yes, and I have any position of influence around collection development, I can speak out about the need for greater diversity and representation in our collections. The risks are different for me as someone with privilege in this area, and that is a way to use that privilege. So activities like this help us to examine opportunities for change to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. And they help us begin to deconstruct what is at play in creating barriers in libraries and other spaces.
After unpacking privilege within a social justice frame and examining ways in which it plays out, we're moving on to explore how privilege can manifest in inequity and create barriers, specifically through implicit bias and microaggressions. So we'll start with the definition of implicit bias. Implicit bias is the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. This definition is adapted from the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity at Ohio State University, which is a leading resource for research on implicit bias. So let's look now at the key characteristics of implicit bias. First, implicit bias is pervasive, meaning that we all have implicit or unconscious bias. It is related to, but distinct from, explicit bias. So where explicit bias drives our unconscious actions based on conscious convictions, for example, racism, sexism, homophobia, or ableism, both implicit and explicit bias relies on associations that are both positive and negative. Our implicit bias contradicts our declared values and beliefs. For example, my values and beliefs support freedom of gender identity and expression. I don't believe in the gender binary, and yet my brain will tend to categorize people I first meet as one of the two genders. The penultimate is that we generally favor our own in-group. The research has shown that we can still hold implicit biases against our own in-group. Research by Harvard sociologist David R. Williams revealed that 1/3 of Black Americans hold anti-Black bias. And last, implicit bias is malleable. We learn biases over time, and over time we can unlearn them. So we want to take some time to look at some themes around how implicit bias can play out in professional spaces. Implicit bias affects our perceptions and how we see people and perceive situations. Our biased perceptions can then play out in our attitudes or how we respond to people and situations. Biases can influence the attention we pay to different people and different identities. For example, in meetings, are we paying attention to the needs of everyone in the room? Are we providing closed captioning in a virtual meeting or in in-person meeting spaces like conference sessions or boardrooms? Are we using a microphone to make sure our voices can be heard clearly by everyone, including those who might be hard of hearing? Bias can affect listening and specifically the extent to which we actively listen to others as well. Do we have a bias toward the contributions of those we perceive to be men or white or older? Finally, implicit bias can play out in our language and how we frame what we talk about. Do we use inclusive language, such as person-first language? For example, people experiencing homelessness instead of homeless people. This framing acknowledges that homelessness is a situation and not an identity. Yet, person-first language isn't always the preferred approach, and we want to recognize that. Sometimes it's identity first, and that's often the case for disability self-advocates. Identity first language is used as an expression of cultural pride and reclaiming of a disability that has a stigma or negative identity put on it. Identity first language would be blind person or autistic person instead of person who is blind or person who is autistic. Inclusive language is asking people their preferences and being open to learning and respecting the way that people want to be referred to. So another example is gender neutral language, like saying, do you all have any questions instead of do you guys have any questions? Or good morning, everyone, rather than good morning, ladies and gentlemen. That shift to gender inclusive language respects and acknowledges the gender identities of all people, and it also removes assumptions. So let's look at an example that involves libraries. In 2017, the New York Times published findings by a team of economists who determined that local government officials throughout the United States are less responsive to African Americans than they are to whites. And the research sent roughly 20,000 emails to local government employees, including those in public libraries in nearly every county. The emails asked commonplace questions like, could you please tell me what your opening hours are? And the emails were identical, except that half appeared to come from someone with a name associated with African Americans, and the other half used names that have been shown to be associated with whites. So most of the emails received a timely and polite response, but emails from those with African American sounding names were 13% more likely to go unanswered than those with white sounding names. The difference appeared in all regions of the country and was large enough to be statistically significant and unlikely to have been a matter of choice. The image on the right is a screenshot of a tweet by US Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in which she calls out the bias in a headline from another tweet, which read, AOC is underwater with every group except women, non-whites, and 18 to 34-year-olds. Ocasio-Cortez calls this out as an example of what subconscious bias looks like, noting, quote, older conservative white men are considered everyone. And in other words, everyone is an exception or an other to that norm, end quote.
So we'll look now at how implicit bias and privilege, specifically our learned assumptions, and what our privileges allow us to take for granted, how those can manifest as microaggressions. And we'll start by defining microaggressions. Dr. Daryl Wing-Soo from Columbia University has been writing about microaggressions for many years, and he defines them as the brief everyday slights, insults, indignities, and denigrating messages sent to people of color, LGBTQIA+, people with disabilities, to immigrants, by well-intentioned people who are unaware of the hidden messages being communicated. Though Wing-Soo's definition and the books he's written on microaggressions frame much of our understanding, the term microaggression was actually coined in the 1970s by Harvard psychiatrist Chester M. Pierce. One point to make is that the micro here isn't about size, it's about the level at which it occurs, not so much the magnitude. In other words, it refers to individual level interactions as opposed to those at the system, societal, or macro level. We'll explore examples in greater detail, but this image shows some common microaggressions, such as, why do you sound so white? And what are you? Your name is too hard to pronounce. Can I call you Mary? What do your people think about that? And so on. We also want to recognize the reality of overt and deliberate acts of bigotry. And here we're talking about clear and direct acts of aggression versus unintentional microaggressions. These play out in physical manifestations like hate crimes, individual acts of violence, and they also play out in our systems and institutions. These are aggressions at the macro level, and they help us make the distinction from microaggressions. A social justice frame of trying to dismantle power and systemic oppression leads us to examine how laws, legislation, policies reinforce oppression. So an example at the macro level was the transgender military ban that the Trump administration began implementing in 2019. Policies like that affect systems and institutions as well as individuals, and they are clearly intentional. By contrast to those overt acts of aggression, these are the common characteristics of microaggressions. They're often subtle, unintentional, and ambiguous. And these characteristics make microaggressions hard to reconcile. Often they come from people whose intent is positive, but the impact of the words or actions can be harmful. And we'll talk more later about intent versus impact. Daryl Wing-Sue notes, quote, microaggressions hold their power because they are invisible, and therefore they don't allow us to see that our actions and attitudes may be discriminatory, which means that because they can be subtle and ambiguous and unintentional, it can be easier to ignore them.
So let's look at an example of a microaggression in the real world. We saw this question on the earlier slide that called out common racial microaggressions. And this example in this tweet identifies the impact of asking someone, where are you really from? The tweet reads, them, where are you from? Me, Canada. Them, no, where are you really from? Me, Canada. And then it says, it's not the curiosity that offends me. It's that by denying my identity, you place me outside of you and who you think is Canadian. I am Canadian. What underlies this question is the assumption that certain people of color are foreign born, and it carries the message, you are a foreigner and you don't belong here. So we'll look now at a couple of themes around microaggressions. Dr. Daryl Wing-Sue talks about these themes in his book, Microaggressions in Everyday Life, Race, Gender, and Sexual Orientation. Creating these categories or themes gives names to the microaggressions, and naming helps us better understand and address them. So one common theme is color blindness, and this can look like saying, I don't see color, or there's only one race, the human race, or I treat everyone the same. These messages behind those statements are you identify, or your identity is not relevant and your experiences are not real, or your experiences aren't really about race. But we'll come back to this theme. Another theme is the myth of meritocracy. These play into the myth that progress or achievements are based on individual merit and discounts any structural or systemic factors. These are statements that assert that race or gender does not play a role in life successes, or for example, in demographics and professions like librarianship. This might sound like, I believe the most qualified person should get the job. And it carries the message that people of color are given extra unfair benefits because of their race. It can also sound like everyone can succeed in this society if they work hard enough. The implicit message here might be people of color are lazy and or incompetent and need to work harder.
So imagery can be just as powerful and meaningful as words. When we see, and in some cases celebrate, images that are stereotypical and demeaning, the image is dismissive of people's identities and their histories. So examples are sports mascots and team names that represent American Indian communities and identities. In July 2020, Washington, D.C.'s national football team announced they would change their name and their mascot. This came after a letter signed by 87 shareholders and investors worth a combined $620 billion was sent to companies that are sponsors of the NFL and or of Washington's team, including FedEx and Nike. And the letter asked the companies to sever ties with the team unless it changed the name. Before that, Indigenous activists had been working for decades to get the team name change. Like interpersonal microaggressions, these images are invalidating and in this case racist, but unlike microaggressions, they are macro. They happen at the societal level. These images are part of our environment. Another example is Halloween costumes that represent ethnicities. The images on the slide on the right are from the We're a Culture, Not a Costume campaign created by Ohio University students. And this was 2011, but unfortunately still relevant today. So what might microaggressions look like in our professional landscape? Jane Allaby conducted a study of microaggressions in academic libraries and published the results in the Journal of Academic Librarianship. The purpose of the study was to investigate the prevalence of racial microaggressions in the academic library environment and to determine whether non-minority librarians are conscious of racial microaggressions that their minority colleagues are experiencing. Allaby found that non-minority staff were less likely to experience microaggressions in the workplace and less likely to observe microaggressions happening in the library. So we'll look at the results of the study. Going back to the theme of colorblindness, 14.6% of the minority professionals reported that a colleague has said they are colorblind, while only 1% of non-minority professionals reported this. In exploring microaggressions, in terms of our interactions with colleagues and community members, we also need to remember that these issues are firmly rooted within institutions. My office works on recruitment and retention of librarians of color, and we have seen some progress in our efforts to recruit, but we've found that retaining library workers of color hasn't been as successful. Microaggressions play a part in this, in creating and sustaining institutional cultures that aren't as inclusive and equitable for everyone. And that's why we need to build awareness of these issues, not only for serving communities, but for the profession as a whole. We want to mention an online platform called LAS Microaggressions. It's lasmicroaggressions.com. And it's a space for those working in libraries, archives, and information fields to share their experiences with microaggressions. We'll move now to exploring the impact of microaggressions and some ways to address them. And this is a process of building awareness, of self-reflection, and humility. And we want to start by talking about intent versus impact. As the slide says, we judge ourselves on our intent, and we judge others on their impact. Going back to our definition, microaggressions are slights or denigrating messages by well-intentioned people who are unaware of the hidden messages being communicated. As Gerald Wing Sue notes, it's outside the conscious awareness of the person perpetuating the microaggression. He also points out that even with the best intentions, we can say or do things that are offensive and hurtful. We can assume positive intent, and that means choosing to believe that we're doing and saying the best we can with what we know, and that means allowing for mistakes. And while we can assume positive or innocent intent when we're talking about microaggressions, we also want to be accountable for the impact our words might have, and to remember that what we say becomes part of a larger history of experience of those we interact with. In other words, a comment we made innocently can have a compounding and harmful effect, given the lived experiences of the person on the receiving end of our comment. So if we're in a position of having engaged in a microaggression, we can ask ourselves, what might have been my intent with that comment? Was I trying to connect or engage with a colleague? And while that may be true, I am accountable for the impact, and I realize now that my approach was harmful.
So looking more at impact, research shows that people experiencing microaggressions feel the microaggressions create a hostile and invalidating climate. As Gerald Wing Sue notes, experiencing microaggressions saps people's spiritual and psychic energies, and their cumulative nature can result in depression, frustration, anger, rage, loss of self-esteem, anxiety, etc. So if we know that is the impact of microaggressions over time, then we need to be willing to explore ways to disrupt them. So keeping in mind the impact of microaggressions as we start to explore ways to confront them, we need to recognize the risk that may come into play when we challenge what have become, in some cases, cultural norms. You may find that you've missed an opportunity to speak up, but instead of focusing on a missed opportunity, we encourage people to do self-reflection. Another situation will likely come up, and after reflecting, it is easier to address it the next time it comes around. To that end, we're sharing some considerations, and the expectation is not that you'll stop and ask yourself these questions in the moment, but we'll consider them to help prepare you for situations. So these questions are, what kind of risk will I be taking if I speak up? Do I feel I am safe from physical or emotional abuse of any kind? Do I have a sense of what I want to achieve when I speak up? Will I regret not speaking up? For example, could not speaking up convey that I condone the action? So we want to consider the issue and the relationship. So the issue underlying the comment that was made and the relationship you have with the person making the comment is key here. If the issue and or the relationship are important to you and you're in a position to be able to speak up, do so. But we need to consider the consequences of speaking up and of remaining silent. Think about the spaces where you feel safe pushing back on a comment or an interaction with a colleague. Where do your power and privilege lie? It is in those spaces that it becomes important to speak up. It can be scary to push back and intervene, but thinking through these questions and through possible scenarios can help you prepare to respond. So know also that you don't always have to respond in the moment. You can come back to an issue after you've had time to reflect. In social justice work, we need to care for ourselves as much as we care for each other. And sometimes that means we walk away and not engage in the moment. Self-care might mean distancing yourself from the experience, particularly if you're the one on the receiving end of the microaggression. However, if we always refrain from engaging, nothing changes. We encourage speaking up more often. And one way to become more comfortable and more effective in speaking up is to consider these questions we've provided. And there's also more than one way to intervene. And we'll talk about that now. So one strategy for intervention is to model the behavior. And this can look like demonstrating inclusive practices, such as how we share our pronouns at the start of the session, or as we talked about earlier, using inclusive person-first language. So when I'm in a conversation or facilitating a workshop and someone uses a term that is considered outdated or offensive, I make it a point to try and follow up in my response with more inclusive language. So for example, if someone uses the phrase illegal immigrant in my response, I would use more inclusive, updated language like immigrant without legal status or person who's undocumented. That person-first framing is important because actions are illegal, people aren't. And calling someone illegal is both dehumanizing and criminalizing. Another approach is to model by sharing our experiences. It can be powerful to model vulnerability and fallibility and to show that we are all learners and in this process together. So we weren't born with the knowledge we have now about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Rather, we can use our own stories and experiences to share how we've unlearned or are in the process of unlearning harmful and or misleading associations or assumptions. For example, I've been open about my efforts to reframe and retrain my brain, particularly around gender identities and pronouns. For me, that means deliberately disrupting that shortcut, categorizing and not automatically gendering and potentially misgendering someone. The more that I consciously disrupt that process, the more practice I'm getting, but it's ongoing. And despite my best intentions and my support of people's determined self-identities, I still experience times when I assume someone's pronouns are he or she, even though I know that some people use different pronouns. But it's important to me to get someone's pronouns right, and I always appreciate being corrected. So with the goal of education, it's not about winning a point or making someone feel bad or wrong. It's about opening a dialogue and helping someone understand something from a different perspective.
It can be powerful to reframe an incident, an event, or a discussion to reveal a different assumption or conclusion, and this is something worth practicing. Consider the microaggressions you may have experienced or witnessed. We always go back in our minds to think about how we should have responded, and it's okay to think through some of that in the moment. So going back to the theme of color blindness, if someone were to say, "I don't see color, I treat everyone the same," you might reframe the conversation as, we need to move from an equality model that treats everyone the same to an equity model that takes into account people's needs and their lived experiences, their access to or the inequities that create barriers for them. For something like there's only one race, the human race, we might counter that with, while race is a social construct that relies on biological fallacy, it does have very real implications for and impacts on people's lives and experiences. So these are just a few strategies we've shared that can help us begin to address microaggressions. And we really encourage deeper exploration and continued conversations around this. That's really the case for all of the concepts we've talked about this morning: privilege, implicit bias, microaggressions. And we recognize that this has been more of a high-level introduction, so we really encourage digging into and understanding each of them at a deeper level. And on that note, we leave you with some questions for reflection. They are, how are privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions relevant to the work of libraries? What do you think the barriers might be to addressing privilege, implicit bias, and microaggressions in your work? And what assets or opportunities exist to address them in your work? So we're going to put up our contact information because I think we're at the end of our time. But we want to say that we welcome folks reaching out to us. If you have questions you'd like answers to that we obviously didn't have time to get to, please email those to us. You can reach us at diversity@ala.org. And you can also reach our office by visiting ala.org/diversity, where you'll find more resources for equity, diversity, and inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Kristen and Mariel. Too bad we couldn't have you in person out here in Utah, but hope you enjoy where you're at. Thank you everyone for joining us. We hope you enjoy your other sessions. We'll let you get off and start your day. Thanks for being with us.